Teach us, Rav Kevin. Talk to us.
Okay, Rosh Hashiva and esteemed Kohen and our king. Okay, this is for the refuah shlema for all cholim, speedy recovery for all of them. Okay, then just something very short here. Heralding the onset of Shabbat. In many communities, the sexton, I think that's the gabbai, announces that Shabbos is coming and that people should cease malacha half an hour before Shabbat, corresponding to the horn blast of earlier times. So what they do in Israel is they have like not a siren, they have some sort of sound and music, like Beit Shemesh, and I'm not sure in Jerusalem you hear they have this music that they play, a certain type. It wouldn't be a siren because people would think it's a chatz v'chalila, like a rocket. So it's a type of indication that you should cease malacha, corresponding to the horn blasts of earlier times. I think that means the shofar. This is a recommended practice. A community spread over a large area should have volunteers circle the streets, using people to close their stores and get ready for Shabbos. Craftsmen should be told to stop working 1.25 hours before sunset. Storekeepers especially must be notified to close their stores at an hour or so before Shabbos. And then the last point, it is recommended that the community always recite Kabbalat Shabbat and Ma'ariv before nightfall. This especially applies when Yom Tov falls on Friday. Why that is, I'm not sure, but that's okay. So that's just okay.
All right, guys, let's get straight to it. Firstly, Arthur, you're looking a lot better, mate. You were looking horrendous tired yesterday.
I had a good sleep.
Did you? Are you feeling okay?
You look fully refreshed.
Yeah, look, traveled a lot today. I had a good sleep. I woke up like 9, 10 o'clock this morning. Passed out when I got home basically during your meeting, and then again woke up, got back to bed. But I'm good now.
Okay.
I'm keeping the recording from last night because I've never slept so well. So I'm going to keep playing it every night. So I don't take as you said, I'm the guy. What's the name again? The Asian anti, whatever.
All right. So with that being said, I made $1 million as the new solution for benzodiazepine.
James, you're now a fully qualified rabbi.
Yeah, Sham, you were out for the count. So, all right, guys, we're going to get straight to it because Gavin's got a braai. Obviously, according to the explanation, there's no longer any necessity to say that contradiction is the beginning of Hazama, according to Abaya, because at no point were the first witnesses contradicted before being rendered Zomamim. I'm not going to go through Arthur why. It's up to you and I maybe to have a 5-minute catch-up session in which I can catch you up really without you having to listening to the show because you're a quick study. So we'll do that privately. Lucky you. And Abaya proceeds to cite support for his interpretation of the Brisa. Because remember, Abaya said that there were only 2 sets of witnesses, whereas Rabba said there were 3. So Abaya said, from where do I know that this is the case under discussion? And congratulations, guys, we've hit the 74th daf. From the fact that the latter part of the Brisa deals with the case of reversal and hazamah. In other words, it deals with a case where there were only 2 sets of witnesses. The first to testify to one sequence of events, and the second to reverse the sequence of events and also rendered the first zomamim within the utterance of one testimony of a statement. Okay? Now, obviously, Abaya says then if that's the first case of the Brisa, it must be presumed, if that's the latter part of the Brisa, it must be presumed that the first part of the Brisa also deals with the case of reversal and hazamah, meaning just 2 sets of witnesses, so there's consistency. And the reason Abaya finds it necessary to prove from the Brisa's second case that the first case deals with 2 sets of witnesses is obviously, guys, because the Brisa's statement in the first case is, indeed, the master claims this. Obviously, that doesn't fit well with the Abaya's explanation, because if there were only 2 sets of witnesses, then the witnesses who testified that the master first blinded the eye and then knocked out the tooth were the first to testify. They weren't preceded by witnesses testifying to the reverse. So why should the master claim that statement when when the effect of the testimony is to free his slaves. Obviously, a buyer therefore feels that it's necessary to demonstrate that the brisa deals with only two sets of witnesses. He said it's an easier solution. So he does this by demonstrating that the brisa's latter case deals with only two sets, and thereby lending support to his conclusion that the brisa's first case also deals with two sets. Okay. So, so accordingly, what are we dealing here with, according to a buyer, is indeed the master claims this must be explained in this way. So the master knows that he first knocked out the tooth and then blinded the eye. And he expects witnesses to come forward eventually and say so. So that when there's another testimony of witnesses that say, listen, he first blinded the eye of the slave, and that obviously renders the slave free. And now as a free man, the slave can sue for the tooth. It's financially beneficial to him because, as Kevin said quite rightly yesterday, it's a low amount that the owner of the slave would have to pay for damages as a free man for the second blow. In other words, the first blow renders the slave free, and the second blow as a free man allows him to sue the master because they're both free men. So obviously that's how a bias explains it. Now, we're going on to the next part. For the latter part of the brisa teaches, if witnesses say we testify about so-and-so, that he knocked out the tooth of his slave and then blinded his eye. So here we're dealing with the case that knocked out the tooth of his slave and then blinded the eye. And indeed, the slave claims this as well. Okay, because the testimony not only renders him a free man, but entitles him to much bigger damages as the slave. And then they were subsequently exposed as zomamim. They pay the value of the eye to the master, not the slave, because he doesn't have any money and he's going to do whatever's going to grant him freedom. You know, at the end of the day, whether it's an eye or tooth, he's just happy to not be indentured with a life of servitude anymore. So what's the case of the discussion? If, as the simple reading the brisa suggests, the latter witnesses who exposed the first cases, zomamim, they don't concede that the master injured the slave at all, then the first witnesses should have to pay the value of the entire slave to the master, not just the value of the eye. So the Gemara is suggesting, why is it the case that when they're made to be Eidim Zomamim, that they don't have to pay the master not only the bigger amount that he had to pay in terms of the damages to the eye, but also for the value of the slave that they set free? So what do you think the answer is, guys?
Just repeat the question, please.
The question the Gemara is asking from yesterday is it saying, look, so if there were false witnesses testifying that the master hit the slave first in the tooth, rendering him free, and then hit him in the eye, rendering the slave as a free man to sue the master for the higher expensive organ that was damaged, which was the eye, not only should, as the brisa says, the master pay the free man slave for his eye, but he should actually, the zomamim should pay the master back for the slave that they sought to extract from him. That's the rule of Eidim Zomamim. What you seek to extract, you should get back. Why is the master only paid back for the false testimony of the eye? It's obvious, guys.
I know what you're getting at. Arthur's in good spirits. Arthur?
The only paying back only for the eye because the slave, he said, didn't have any money.
No. What we're talking about is something else. Okay, what we're saying is here, the slave, you're absolutely right, is we don't make the slave pay for anything, but the false witnesses that got the slave master to pay the higher amount for the eye. The Gemara says that when they're caught to be lying, they have to pay the master back for the more expensive fee of the organ that was damaged, which was the eye. Because if he hit the tooth first and freed the slave, then as a free person, the slave sued the master for the eye. And if the false witnesses corroborated with the slave, and therefore those false witnesses have to pay the master back the value that they sought to extract from him, which was the eye, why don't these items have to pay the master back for the slave that was freed? on false
I'll
testimony?
tell you. I know the answer. I will say
Tell me, Gavin.
So the answer to this is that because they weren't lying about that specific about the slave being released. Both lots of witnesses. There was no contradiction as far as the slave being released, either through the one or the other. That's the answer.
Perfect answer. So what Gavin says is correct, is that there were no dispute between any of the sets of witnesses as far as the master damaging the slave is concerned. All agree that the slave was hit. In terms of which order, bang, bang, the tooth or the eye or the tooth, that's the only argument. But either way, the slave goes free. So when they found to be conspiring, it's only on the issue that they disagree. But both agree that, in fact, that an injury took place. It was only the conspiracy to make the master pay more for the more valuable organ. Okay. So, Gavin, well done. That's perfect. Okay. So the Brisa refers to a case where the second set reversed the first testimony of the sequence of events and testified that the master first blinded the slave's eye and then knocked out his tooth, and also exposed them as zomimim. So what we are saying is here is that the zomimim refers here to pay the master the value of the eye, because they conspired to have him pay the slave. But they do not have to pay the value of the slave, because the slave goes free in any case because of the testimony of the second set, which is exactly what Gavin says. So it's clear that the second set case of the Brisa is dealing with only two sets of witnesses, with the second set both reversing the order of the injuries and rendering the first set as zomimim. Hence, it may be presumed that the Brisa's first case also deals with two sets of reversal and hazamah. So all Abai is saying is that in both cases, there's a consistency. When the Brisa's first example talks about the witnesses, he's saying there's two sets of witnesses. In the second case, also two sets. There's consistency. So now we've established that the Brisa deals with only two sets of witnesses, and with reversal and hazamah. Abai must qualify other aspects of the Brisa's case. Okay. So in other words, the analysis that follows relates to both cases of the Brisa, and it's necessitated by Abai's explanation. When you say that there's reversal and hazamah, you can only be talking about two sets of witnesses. And what we are saying is here, let me just simplify the question. Is if the last witnesses, guys, assign a later date to the master inflicting the injuries to the slave. So let's say, for example, the first set testified that the master knocked out the slave's tooth and then blinded his eye on Sunday. And the second set testified that they were with them elsewhere on the Sunday. But the master inflicted the injuries on Monday in the opposite order. Okay, what's the problem there? Do any of you know?
With different dates.
And therefore?
So, guys, help.
The testimony then is they're not. There's no liability. They're not liable for.
It's not consistent.
They should cancel each other out.
No. Well, we've got a bigger problem, because what I'm saying is as follows. If you're accusing the person of having damaged his slave a day before it actually happened, then in fact, you're seeking to free somebody that wasn't damaged on that day. So that's the problem. Those false witnesses should have to be actually paying for the slave back to the master. Because Arthur, they're not only lying about the sequence of events with the organs, but the problem is if they heard about this, just say that I'm just seeing the top of your head. I'm not even seeing you, Arthur. I'm seeing the fan. Arthur, are you there?
Just to leave my client. Just give me a second.
Oh, no problem. Sorry, mate. Sorry. Okay.
Put it in there? No. Okay, cool. What do you want to do with the plate?
Okay, Arthur's got his hands full. So what I'm saying is, guys, is as follows, is that the primary problem is that they're coming up and they're saying to the judge that this incident of him assaulting his slave occurred a day before. So therefore, the infraction never happened at that point. So they should technically own the master for the slave. Because even if there was an assault, it took place on the Monday, not the Sunday. Does that make sense? That's the problem that we're dealing with at the moment.
How come this has never come up until this example? Because we've had cases where, did they always testify on the same date on the prior cases?
So this is what, yeah, I think this can be resolved very, very easily, okay? Because if you want to say that the last witnesses assigned a later date to the masters inflicting the injuries on the slave, then the false witnesses should still have to pay the value of the entire slave to the master for the time they made the person liable to let the slave go free. Because he was a person who was not yet liable to do so. So obviously then, Gavin, the Bryson must be referring to a case where even though it was a second set of witnesses, they assigned an earlier date to the masters inflicting an injury on the slave. In other words, they testified that the master inflicted the injuries before the first witnesses came to testify. And in that case, the Adim Zumamim technically gave a later date. So the injury had already occurred. That's the only reason why we don't make the Adim Zumamim pay for the slave. Because it was already not in dispute. So generally what happened was as follows, is it made sure that what would happen is that there would be a rumor, right? A master would hit a slave and then the word would get out. So somebody hears a rumor about this. You could say they like the master, they don't like the master, or whatever the case may be. But at the end of the day, when they heard the rumor that went out, they're obviously going to assign a later date as if they're conspirators, because if they assign an earlier date to when it's happened, and they were caught out, they'd have to pay for the slave as well as the injuries. It's too high a risk. So that's all the Bryce is saying, that the Adim Zomamim in this Gemara, it's not brought up as an issue because they clearly made it a later date. That's all. When they were testifying. That's why it's not an issue at all. All right. Let's just go on. There's a further clarification that I want to make, that if the master had not yet been sued in court by the slave at the time that the first witnesses came to attest to the injuries, the Adim Zomamim should still have to pay the entire of the value of the slave to the master, because the person against whom they testified was not yet liable at the time that they testified. Rather, the Bryson must be speaking of a case where he had already been sued in court, and the court had ruled that the master must free the slave and pay damages for the second injury. So all it was saying is, even if the second witnesses testified that the master had already inflicted the injuries on the slave before the Zimmerman gave their testimony, that alone wouldn't absolve the Zimmerman from paying the full value of the slave to the master. Because even though he'd inflicted the injuries before they gave their testimony, he wasn't yet liable to free the slave, because there's a law, which I'm battling with this, that a slave goes free when his master maims is actually a knas, it's a penalty. And one who admits to a fine is exempt. So the master could still have come to court at that point and have exempted himself from freeing a slave by admitting what he'd done. Therefore, when they testified that he was liable to free a slave, they were attempting to deprive him of a slave that was not yet obligated to free. So I tell you what my problem is with this, twofold. The first issue I have is, why would you have a pasuk? And I'll just quote the pasuk now. Just give me 1 second. Let me see if I've got it here. It says in Shmor, chapter 21, verse 26 to 27, if a man strikes the eye of his slave or the eye of his slave woman and destroys it, he shall set him free in place of his eye. And if he knocks out his tooth of his slave or the tooth of his slave woman, he shall set him free in place of his tooth. It's evident from the verse that destroying even one of these organs will set the slave free. Okay, that's the commentary. But the problem that we've got with this is that I don't understand why you would go to all the trouble to mention a pasuk, okay, And at the end of the day, you say that he gets out of it because it's a knas, it's a penalty. So if he goes, he said, I did bad, I smashed him to pieces, I'm really sorry, you don't lose your slave. I mean, why go through the bother of putting it in a pasuk that you do? In other words, if you admit to a knas, a penalty, you're off the hook. But the only thing I can think of is that if you look at a tam ox, remember when we dealt with the keren damage, we dealt with the tam and muad. And was it a mamun, a compensation, or what it was a knas? I think as far as I remember, as far as that was concerned, you admit to it by a fine, so you don't, you don't have to, you don't have to trouble the court. But it means if you don't have to trouble the court, surely you'd have to make restitution. Because if you don't make restitution, why not let the person just sue you? It doesn't make sense. So it could mean that either that there has to be a due legal process where the slave can sue the owner. But what happens if the owner runs to the court first and admits to his fine? Does he just not allow, is he off the hook from freeing the slave? It would seem so from this commentary in the Gemara.
But he can keep fighting with the slave and chop off his fingers one by one and keep admitting to it, and then you know what I'm saying.
It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
But that's how you get out of the whole thing. It's like a loophole. So really
it doesn't make sense, especially for the fact that it's going to say that he hasn't yet been sued in court. So the only thing that I can say is that if the slave master is quick enough, he gets off by admitting it first. It doesn't make sense to me. It must be more to it than that. Otherwise, it doesn't seem fair. Why bring up a whole pasuk? What? So what if the master? What happens if he locks up his slave quickly because it's his property and quickly runs to the court to admit his fine and he's off the hook? So let's just put it as non-commentary and say that the slave has to sue the master first. Because if the first set of witnesses attest to the injury, and the first set are known as Eidim Zumamim, they're liable for this to pay for the slave, but not if the second set are Eidim Zumamim, because the first set already testified to that fact. Do you see what we're saying? You've got to look at the order here. You've got to say that the second set are Eidim Zumamim according to this order. Because even if you turn around and say that the second set chosen an earlier date, they'd be obligated for the slave. If they didn't choose an earlier date and it was the first set, there hadn't been any master sued in court by a slave, and therefore they were the first witnesses, and that word would be cancelled out by the master, because basically the master could run and say, he's not obligated to pay for the slave unless that issue is put in court. It's because it's a penalty. So it's not an automatic obligation. So we're saying two things. Firstly, that the Eidim Zumamim would have to be the second set, or alternatively, they would have to say that why the second set? Because the first set would have to bring it up as a matter and not be lying about it, in order for the second set not to owe for the value of the slave when they were caught as Eidim Zumamim and only have to pay for the eye. That's the one reason. The second reason is that they would have to say that the event occurred at a later date compared to the first set, because if they were caught out, the damage to the slave already took place, which technically they never said an event happened that didn't happen. In other words, the master should have already freed the slave. So in that particular case, they're not responsible for anything more than the eye. That's the 2 points I want to bring across. Okay, so let's just go on. In the preceding Gemara, Rava interprets the Brisa's first case as dealing with 3 sets of witnesses. The first set that testified that the master first destroyed the slave's tooth and then his eye. A second set that testified the reverse, that the master first destroyed the eye and then the tooth. And remember that the master was happy with that. Why? As Kevin said, because according to the second set that are Eidim Zumamim, the master is paying less. And then the third set exposed the second set as Eidim Zomimim. So from the Bryce's ruling that the second witnesses are liable as conspiring witnesses, even though their testimony was already contradicted by the first set before they were exposed as conspiring witnesses. So therefore, Rava deduced that if witnesses testified to a murder and were subsequently contradicted, they nonetheless remain subject to hazamah, which is the reciprocal penalty, at the hands of other witnesses. For contradiction is at the beginning of hazamah. So we said that although their testimony was set aside before they were exposed as conspiring witnesses, we don't treat them as invalidated witnesses that they cancel each other out, because as Gavin said yesterday, they're just proving the inconsistency of these witnesses. So therefore, contradiction is at the beginning of hazamah because it's proving their track record of lying. So the Gemara questions Rava's inference, even according to his interpretation, that the Brisa deals with three sets of witnesses. Okay? So Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, said to Rav Ashi, from where did Rava deduce that a contradiction is at the beginning of hazamah? If you say that the Brisa's first case, and that first case, if you remember, was in 73b, is when, according to Rava, the first witnesses state that the master is liable to pay for the eye, because all of the damage was tooth eye. So then, obviously, as a free man, the slave will sue for the eye. The middle witnesses reverse it and say the master first hit the eye, and as a free man, the slave can sue for the tooth, at which case the master is very happy because he's paying the low amount, as Kevin said. There's no proof from this case. Now, guys, I'm going to explain the reason. It's actually very clever. Okay? Because in the Brisa's first case, the middle witnesses contradicted and their testimony is set aside. That's the question. What we want to know is, are they contradicted? Okay, so again, two sets of witnesses. First set says damage to tooth, then eye, therefore the master is liable for the eye. The second set of witnesses says damage to the eye, first freeing the slave, and then damage to the tooth, which reduces the master's losses to just the tooth, says the master is pleased with it. Third set saying that basically the second set couldn't have witnessed it because they were never at that location. So what we are saying is here, this doesn't have to be a case where the two cancel out each other, because there's not really a contradiction. Why aren't the middle witnesses contradicted? Because they hadn't been rendered zomimim. The testimony was actually accepted by the court, and it would have remained in accordance with them. So what are we actually saying? Is that firstly, the court agrees with both of them that both of these witnesses said the master damaged the slave's organs. Okay, there's no disagreement with that, which does what? Frees the slave. So both the witnesses agree to that. There's no contradiction. What's the second set? Is that for we would have decided the law in accordance with their testimony and would have required the master to pay the value of the tooth, for included in the testimony of 200 zuz is the testimony regarding 100 zuz. Therefore, it's really the first witnesses whose testimony was contradicted and set aside. So let me explain to you in Damon language what I'm saying. If you have a case, remember, Kevin, there was a law that says that if Arthur is suing me for damages, he has to prove his case with evidence. Otherwise, anybody could sue anybody. So if two people are arguing that about in which order the master hit the slave, either way the slave goes free, there was damage done. They're only arguing whether it's a tooth or eye. So what does the court award Arthur in absence of evidence in terms of damages to the slave? If there's no proof and they cancel each other out, they don't just they agree that the slave goes free. They're not arguing with each other. But what are the damages? How do we work it? Tell me.
Yeah, Arthur first, otherwise I can try.
No. You can try.
Okay, so
Arthur's relief on the man's face.
You add the value of the tooth to the value of the eye, and you divide it by 2, and you give an average.
Okay, personally, I think that's a very logical explanation. To me, that is a very logical explanation. That's what the Meiri says. Well, what the Meiri was suggesting in terms of a point of difference. But that's not the majority of the opinion. The majority of the opinion is that if Arthur's got two cars, okay, and he says to me, one witness says, I hit his Porsche in the garage. I went through his wall. I hit his Porsche. And the other witnesses say, I hit his Golf. Okay. May you only have such bracha, Arthur, of a Porsche and a Golf.
Amen.
So, and more bracha. Amen. So,
Amen.
so what I'm saying is the witnesses agreed I went through Arthur's wall and I hit his car. The one says the Porsche, the one says the Golf. Now, the court's not going to say, well, let's take the difference between a Porsche and a Golf because I'll be broke. Don't say that word. Do you get what I'm saying? I would be. So you can't take the middle of the line, Kev. It's too broad. It could bankrupt an innocent person. What you do is you take the lower amount in the absence of proof before the days of insurance. I could say, Your Honor, unless you can prove I hit the Porsche, why should we take the middle of the road? Because I'm going to lose money hand over foot. And if Arthur said it's the Porsche, I'll say, Arthur, if you've got camera footage on a webcam, prove it. If you can show your car of the Porsche's damage, prove it. But in the absence of proof, I'm prepared to pay the minimum amount unless you can prove otherwise, because you're seeking to extract damages from me. You need evidence. Therefore, the middle witnesses are not contradicted. The court is going with their verdict because they are reducing the master's fee to the truth because there's no evidence to the contrary, because the one witnesses say the more expensive amount. The other witnesses say the less expensive amount. Okay? So therefore, we would deduce it's the less expensive amount since they're contradicting each other on that basis because we're not going to award the higher amount. Does that make sense? They both agree the slave goes free. So therefore, the court agrees with the middle witnesses. Now, even if afterwards they're found to be Eidim Zomamim, we can't make those witnesses pay more than the tooth because the court awarded the tooth anyway. What were they seeking to extract? They can't pay the value of the eye difference. Why? Because in the absence of proof, so therefore, for in accordance with their testimony, it would have required the master to pay the value of the tooth. Included in the testimony of 200 zuz is testimony for 100 zuz. So all the Gemara is saying both sets agree that he owes at least the less amount of the tooth, the value of the tooth, right? So had there been no hazamah, reciprocal penalty, and the contradiction between the two sets had remained standing, the court would have required the owner to pay the lesser amount. Therefore, it's really the first set of witnesses whose testimony was contradicted and set aside. So what this argument is against Rava is that whose testimony was set aside? The ones that said more expensively that the eye was damaged last, because they don't bring proof. So since their testimony is set aside, this is not a case that the middle witnesses have been contradicted and set aside whatsoever. Because by awarding the slave the value of the tooth, the court would in fact be ruling in accordance with the testimony of the middle set. You say that that's all the master owes, right? So the court would be setting aside only the testimony of the first set who wanted the more expensive amount. It turns out they were telling the truth. But that amount was set aside because it was a greater value and there was an absence of proof because they were contradicting each other. So it's for that reason, perhaps, that the second set remains subject to the reciprocal penalty, because despite the contradiction, their testimony has in fact prevailed by the court. So how can Rava prove from this case that Hazamah takes effect even on witnesses whose testimony was set aside on account of being contradicted? So in other words, what it's saying is if you look at the first case of the Brisa, the testimony wasn't contradicted of the Eidim Zomamim. The other guys were, because the Eidim Zomamim were seeking to make the slave master pay less. So their testimony was awarded by the court. So now we don't apply the reciprocal penalty, because what are you going to make them pay? The less amount. That's what they wanted to be paid to the slave, was the less amount. So that's what the court awarded. That's not a contradiction of testimony. in any way. Court went with it. So therefore, hang on, the reversal of Hazama at the beginning of the process doesn't take place with this first case. So that was the argument that they have about Rava. Now tomorrow's session we'll see how Rava defends himself pretty well.
So, Damon, one thing you said to me, the one thing I wanted to do is I want to extract nothing but the truth.
That's what I was going to say, Arthur. You spoiled it for me now. That's exactly what I was going to say. That's what you extract from this, and you can only extract the tooth.
But it's funny when it comes from me.
I see your point of view. Yeah.
Nothing but the truth, only the truth.
Exactly.
The eye is very sensitive.
So guys, do you get the argument against Rava?
Yeah, let's all say I get it.
Yeah.
You guys, we'll say I. All right. I just carried on from the tooth part.
So, guys, do you understand why that's not a contradiction of Hazama? I'm happy to go at this point.
Yeah.
So basically, then the day, if lack of proof, to pay the lesser amount.
Yes, and therefore the court has gone with the false witnesses in terms of their verdict. Yeah. So when it's proven that they're false, the court's gone with them. What have they sought to take away from the other party? Because the other party couldn't bring evidence, so that's why they contradicted each other. If they brought photos, then other witnesses say, okay, it's your word against him, but he brought photos. So their case wasn't stronger. So how can you make them pay a reciprocal penalty if the court went with their verdict because there was an absence of proof from the other side? That's not a contradicted testimony. And they both agreed the slave should go free. So therefore...
But hold on 1 second, Damon. If those second witnesses didn't come, you wouldn't have needed the proof. The witnesses would have been sufficient.
I agree with you in that you're saying if there wasn't a second set, we would have gone with the eye. And it was only because of the troublesome second set that they had to settle for the two.
Now I need evidence.
Yes, but the point is correct. I need to just answer your question. Not a time for a joke at the moment. So, Gavin, what I was saying to you is your question is completely sound, except it still proves that the first set of witnesses, in the days where they couldn't take a photograph, needed to do a little bit more by taking statements or having something stronger than your word against the other word. Because the slave master could have had anybody could have had a different word. There's got to be strong evidence. And in the absence of evidence, innocent people get hurt. And I agree with you. They should be made. But the other case wasn't strong enough. We have to go with due process. Does that make sense? In other words, you're wrong. You are 100% correct that they should have got the eye. But then they should have had stronger evidence to refute another witness that could contradict him. Everybody's going to bring contradictory witnesses. It's stock standard in a legal case. What's your other evidence?
No, you're right. The point you made now is actually right. It clarified it for me completely. Thanks, but
pleasure. Sometimes what's right is not what happens in court. It's what you can prove. Never forget that. Not about what's right. It's what you can prove. All right.
But you're right. In cases people bring contradict.
Arthur wants to tell a joke. Quickly, tell a joke.
It was about the photo thing. I mean, in the 1800s and 1900s, it took like a minute and stand still. So you imagine with the chisel.
Yeah, he's right. I can see an asterisk and obliques. Wait, we need to take a photo etching. How funny was that scene in 6 Million Ways